Prologue. Echoes in the void. The stars shimmered cold and distant, their light scattered across the dark fabric of space like fragments of a shattered jewel. For all their beauty, they seemed indifferent to the life that clawed for survival beneath their unblinking gaze. Aboard the coalition ship Verdant Horizon, Lyra Quinn stood at the observation deck, staring into the abyss. Behind her, the hum of the ship's engines whispered a steady rhythm. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, a woman in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and a faint scar on her right cheek, a relic of her time on Earth's turbulent diplomatic front. In her hand, she gripped a data pad loaded with reports, troop movements, supply routes, intercepted communiques. The galaxy was a tinderbox, and it was her job to keep the spark from igniting. Ambassador Quinn, a voice called from the doorway. She turned to see Captain Soren, the towering Ulrican commander of the Verdant Horizon. His 4 eyes blinked in unison, his expression unreadable. The Valor envoy has arrived. Lyra sighed, setting the pad aside. Time to meet the mystery guest, then. The Valor were a species cloaked in enigma. Reclusive and rarely seen outside their own worlds, they were whispered about in the galaxy's far corners as ancient and inscrutable. When the Coalition proposed sending a human alongside a Valor envoy to mediate the crisis, Lyra had been skeptical. Humanity was still finding its place among the stars, and partnering with a species infamous for their opacity seemed like a recipe for disaster. Yet here she was, humanity's representative, ready to dance the diplomatic tightrope. Lyra followed Soren to the docking bay. As the airlock hissed open, the first thing she noticed was the silence. No sound of footsteps, no rustling of movement, just an eerie stillness. Then the Valor stepped forward. Thakirian Val was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Standing over 7 feet tall, their lithe form was wrapped in a shimmering, chitinous exoskeleton that refracted light like polished obsidian. Bioluminescent patterns glowed softly along their arms and torso, shifting in hues of blue and green in a rhythm Lyra couldn't decipher. Their face, framed by delicate antennae, bore an expression of calm curiosity, or so she guessed. Thakirian inclined their head in greeting. No words came, but their bioluminescence pulsed in deliberate patterns. Lyra blinked. "Is that a hello?" "Yes," Soren interjected. The Valor communicate primarily through bioluminescence and pheromones. However, Thakirian has studied auditory languages extensively. He gestured to a small, sleek device attached to Thakirian's chest. "This translator will assist." "Understood," Lyra said, straightening. She extended her hand, a human gesture she hoped would be recognized. "Ambassador Lyra Quinn." "It's an honor." Thakirian hesitated for a moment, then mirrored the gesture, their elongated fingers brushing hers lightly. "I am Thakirian Val." "The honor is shared," came the translator's soft voice, a blend of harmonics that felt strangely melodic. The initial awkwardness settled into an uneasy truce as they moved to the conference room. The briefing was short but heavy with implications. The Dominion of Raskari was mobilizing fleets near the Carina Nebula, a region claimed by both them and the Coalition. The nebula's rich deposits of rare minerals made it a strategic prize, and a single misstep could ignite a war. Lyra glanced at Thakirian as the captain concluded the overview. They sat impossibly still, their glowing patterns dimmed to a faint hum of light. When the room emptied, Lyra leaned closer. "Guess we're stuck together," she said lightly. "Hope you're as good at this peacekeeping thing as they say." Thakirian turned their luminous gaze to her. "The silence between stars is sacred. It must not be filled with the echoes of war." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Poetic. Let's hope the Raskari agree." As the ship set course for the neutral station near the nebula, Lyra returned to the observation deck. She found herself watching Thakirian's reflection in the glass. Their bioluminescence pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of a distant star. For all their differences, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they shared an unspoken understanding, the burden of representing their people, and the weight of a galaxy that demanded too much from both of them. Chapter 1. A Meeting of Opposites. The Harmony's oath glided through the edges of the Carina Nebula, its silver hull reflecting the nebula's vibrant hues. From the bridge, the swirling clouds of interstellar gas looked peaceful, almost serene, an ironic backdrop for the brewing conflict. In the conference chamber, Lyra sat across from Thakirian Val, her fingers drumming lightly on the table's surface. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, a gulf of cultural differences waiting to be bridged. Thakirian remained perfectly still, their luminous patterns shifting slowly in what Lyra had begun to recognize as a neutral state. So, Lyra began, breaking the silence, "I get that your people aren't big on words, but we're going to need a strategy before we step into that room." Thakirian tilted their heads slightly, the glow on their chest shifting to a pale blue. "Words are often unnecessary," the translator offered, though its tone was flat compared to the musical cadence of their patterns. "The truth of intent lies beneath." Lyra frowned. "Well, in this case, we're dealing with species who read intent through shouting matches and chest-thumping. They're not going to pick up on your light show." She gestured vaguely at the bioluminescent patterns flowing across their skin. For the first time, Thakirian leaned forward, their antennae twitching slightly. "You believe verbal aggression equates to dominance? In a Raskari negotiation?" "Yes," Lyra said. "They respect strength, and strength to them is loud." Thakirian's lights flickered briefly, almost like a sigh. "A flawed methodology. Tell me about it." Lyra crossed her arms. "But if we don't adapt, this whole mission is dead on arrival." Thakirian remained silent for a moment, their glow dimming to near invisibility. Lyra wondered if they were pondering her words, or quietly judging her species. Finally, their glow returned, shifting to a vibrant green. "I will attempt to vocalize strength." Lyra blinked. "That's great. Thanks for meeting me halfway." Thakirian's response was unreadable, but Lyra thought she detected a faint amusement in their light. It was like trying to read the expressions of an alien starfish. She stifled a laugh at the absurdity of the situation. The meeting with the Raskari delegation was as volatile as Lyra had anticipated. The Raskari envoy, General Kroloth, was a towering mass of muscle and scales, his golden armor glinting under the sterile conference room lights. His voice boomed with every sentence, as though volume alone could enforce his will. "This nebula has been under Raskari patrol for decades," Kroloth roared, slamming a clawed hand on the table. "Your coalition has no claim here." "The nebula belongs to no one," Lyra countered, her tone measured. "Our mission is to ensure its resources benefit all species, not just the strongest." Kroloth let out a guttural laugh. "Spoken like a weakling afraid to fight. Perhaps your species would understand respect if you had claws and fangs." Lyra's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Thakirian interjected. Their translator conveyed the words in a low, deliberate cadence. "Strength without wisdom leads to ruin." The room fell silent. Krolotha's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Thakirian. "What is this? The insect finally speaks." Thakirian's glow shifted to a deep gold, their patterns flowing in steady waves. "Strength is not measured by noise, nor by the scars one bears. It is measured by the legacy one leaves. The Raskari's reputation for honor is well known. Will you dishonor it by waging war over unclaimed dust?" Krolotha's nostrils flared, but he hesitated. Lyra seized the moment. This isn't about strength or weakness. It's about survival. For all of us. A war over this nebula would weaken both our peoples. You've seen what the Coalition can do when united, and we've seen what the Raskari are capable of. Do you really want to test those limits? Kroloth leaned back in his seat, his claws tapping rhythmically on the table. His gaze flicked between Lyra and Thakirien, his skepticism palpable. Perhaps, he rumbled, there is merit in speaking, rather than roaring. He fixed his sharp eyes on Thakirien. But your glowing friend here, can they fight as well as they speak? Lyra opened her mouth to reply, but Thakirien's lights flared a brilliant white, silencing her. They stood, their towering form casting a shadow over the table. Their translator's voice came through, clear and sharp. The Valor do not seek conflict. But if you doubt our resolve, test it, and see what strength truly is. The room froze. Even Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. Kroloth, after a moment, let out a low, rumbling laugh. Perhaps you do have claws after all. After the meeting, Lyra found Thakirien in the ship's observation lounge. Their glow dimmed once more. She approached slowly, feeling the tension from the conference still hanging in the air. That was impressive, she said, leaning against the rail beside them. Thakirien turned their luminous gaze to her. Aggression is not my nature, but adaptation is necessary. Could have fooled me, Lyra quipped. The way you stood up to Kroloth, it was like watching a supernova go off. Thakirien's lights flickered briefly in what Lyra was beginning to interpret as amusement. A calculated risk. I hope it does not backfire. Me too, Lyra said with a half-smile. But for what it's worth, I think we might actually have a shot at this. Thakirien's glow brightened slightly, their patterns softening to a tranquil blue. Hope, the translator murmured, is a powerful thing. Lyra nodded, her gaze drifting back to the stars. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest spark of optimism. In this strange partnership, there was potential, if they could learn to trust each other. Chapter 2. A Fragile Truce. The neutral station orbiting the Carina Nebula was a hodgepodge of architectural styles, reflecting its role as a crossroads for various galactic species. The outer docking platforms bristled with ships from across the Coalition and Dominion, while the central hub buzzed with activity as diplomats, traders, and station personnel navigated its corridors. For all its diversity, the tension in the air was palpable. Every glance carried suspicion, every word a potential spark. Lyra and Thakirien disembarked the Harmony's oath under the watchful eyes of station security. The Raskari delegation had arrived hours earlier, their flagship an imposing mass of spiked metal that dominated the docking bay. Lyra could already feel the pressure mounting as she adjusted the translation device clipped to her ear. The meeting ahead would be critical, and she needed every edge she could muster. The conference room was stark and utilitarian, its walls lined with holographic projectors displaying live feeds of the nebula outside. Lyra sat at the central table, flanked by Thakirien on one side and Captain Soren on the other. Across from them sat General Kroloth and his delegation, their golden scales shimmering under the harsh lighting. "We waste time with these talks," Kroloth growled, leaning forward. His claws scraped against the table's metallic surface. "The Dominion's claim on the nebula is undeniable. Your coalition has no place here." Lyra maintained a calm demeanor, though her fingers itched to slam the table in response. "General, the coalition's interest isn't in ownership. It's in stability. A war over the nebula would destabilize the entire sector." "Stability?" Kroloth sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "A convenient excuse for your encroachment." The tension in the room thickened, but Thakirien's glow shifted to a calming green. When they spoke, Their translator's voice carried a soothing yet firm tone. "General Kroloth, no claim is without contest. The Raskari's strength is respected, but the wisdom of its application must also be evident." Krolotha's yellow eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto Thakirian. "You speak much for one who hides behind light and words. Do you understand what it means to fight? To bleed for your people?" Thakirian's patterns stilled, their glow dimming. "We understand loss, perhaps more deeply than you realize." The room fell silent. Kroloth leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but the sharpness of his tone softened. "Then speak plainly. What does your coalition propose?" After hours of tense negotiation, the first tentative steps toward a truce began to take shape. The coalition proposed joint resource surveys of the nebula, monitored by neutral parties to ensure fair distribution. The Raskari delegation, though reluctant, agreed to consider the terms, pending further discussion. As the meeting adjourned, Lyra leaned back in her chair, exhaling a quiet sigh of relief. It wasn't a victory, but it was progress. "You handled that well," Captain Soren said as they exited the room. "I expected the general to walk out within the first 10 minutes. Lyra glanced at Thakirian, who walked silently beside her. "It wasn't just me," she said. "Thakirian has a way of disarming people, without weapons." Thakirian's glow shifted briefly to gold, a signal Lyra had begun to associate with gratitude. "The Raskari's leader is not without reason," they said. "He respects strength, but he values survival." "Well, let's hope that holds," Lyra replied. "We've got a long way to go." That night, Lyra found herself wandering the station's observation deck, drawn to the view of the nebula. The swirling clouds of pink and orange were mesmerizing, a reminder of both the beauty and volatility of the galaxy. "You admire the silence," Thakirian said, appearing beside her. Their soft glow bathed the metal railing in hues of blue. Lyra smiled faintly. "It's ironic, isn't it? We're here trying to stop a war, and the universe doesn't care. It just keeps spinning." "Perhaps that is its lesson," Thakirian replied. "The stars endure because they do not seek to dominate. They exist in harmony, even in chaos." Lyra turned to face them, her brow furrowing. "That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't help when people like Kroloth are ready to throw everything into a fight." Thakirian's glow brightened slightly. "Even Kroloth seeks something deeper than conflict. He fights to preserve what he values. Understanding that is the first step to guiding him." Lyra crossed her arms, leaning against the rail. "And what about you? Why did the Valor agree to join this mission? Your people usually avoid the rest of us." Thakirian hesitated, their glow dimming as if retreating into themselves. "The Valor once sought isolation to heal wounds of our past. But isolation has its cost. This mission is a chance to rebuild, to find connection." Lyra nodded slowly, her gaze returning to the nebula. "Well, I guess that makes 2 of us. Humanity's not exactly loved out here, but we're trying. For what it's worth, I think you're doing a good job." Thakirian's glow shifted to a warm gold, the patterns flowing like a gentle current. "And you, Lyra Quinn, carry the strength of your people well." For a moment, there was silence. Not the cold, indifferent silence of space, but a shared quiet, filled with understanding. As the nebula's light painted the room in colors of hope, Lyra felt the faintest glimmer of something unexpected. Trust. Chapter 3. Silent Alliances. The neutral station was quieter at night, or at least what passed for night in a structure orbiting the Carina Nebula. The corridors were dimly lit, the hum of machinery a constant backdrop as Lyra made her way to the secure quarters assigned to her and Thakirian. The day's negotiations had been grueling, and though progress had been made, the looming threat of failure still weighed heavily on her. Inside the quarters, the Kyrian stood near the viewport, their bioluminescence casting soft waves of green and blue across the walls. Lyra paused at the doorway, watching them for a moment before speaking. "You don't sleep, do you?" she asked, stepping inside. The Kyrian turned slightly, their glowing patterns shifting to a pale gold. The Valor require little rest in the human sense. This silence is sufficient for renewal. Lyra sank onto the small couch, rubbing her temples. Must be nice. Meanwhile, I'm running on caffeine and nerves. The Kyrian approached, their glow dimming as they tilted their head. Your exhaustion is evident. Perhaps you should rest. I'd love to, Lyra muttered, but every time I close my eyes, I see the galaxy unraveling. You ever feel like that? Like it's all on you to hold things together? The Kyrian's antennae twitched slightly, and their glow shifted to a subdued blue. It is a burden we share, though our methods differ. The Valor know the weight of responsibility well. Lyra raised an eyebrow. You've mentioned that before, how your people withdrew because of some tragedy. What happened? The Kyrian hesitated, their patterns stilling for a moment before resuming in slow, deliberate waves. Long ago, the Valor sought to unite disparate species, much as your coalition attempts now. We believed our understanding of harmony could guide others. What went wrong? Lyra asked, her tone softening. We underestimated the power of fear and distrust, the Kyrian said, their voice quiet. Our efforts were met with suspicion. When conflict erupted, it consumed many, including those we sought to protect. In the end, we withdrew to preserve what little remained. Lyra sat back, processing the weight of their words. And now you're trying again. That's brave. The Kyrian's glow brightened slightly. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is merely the realization that isolation is not a true sanctuary. Connection is necessary, even if it brings pain. For a moment Lyra said nothing, the silence between them heavy with shared understanding. Finally, she broke the quiet. You know, for all your glowing wisdom, you're not half bad company. The Kyrian's patterns shifted to a soft gold, their version of amusement, Lyra guessed. And you, Lyra Quinn, are far less chaotic than your species' reputation suggests. Lyra laughed, the sound breaking the tension like sunlight piercing a storm cloud. I'll take that as a compliment. The next morning, the tenuous calm of the station was shattered by an explosion. Lyra jolted awake to the blare of alarms, the quarters shaking as a muffled blast reverberated through the station. She stumbled to her feet, grabbing the communicator from the table. What the hell was that? An attack. Captain Soren's voice came through, clipped and urgent. Unknown origin. Security is locking down the station. Are you and Kyrian safe? Lyra glanced toward the viewport, where Kyrian was already standing, their glow flickering in sharp, erratic patterns. We're fine, but what's going on? Get to the secure meeting room, Soren ordered. Now. Kyrian was at the door before Lyra could say another word. Together, they navigated the chaotic corridors, dodging panicked diplomats and station personnel. Security forces were already on high alert, their weapons drawn as they escorted delegations to safety. When Lyra and Kyrian arrived at the meeting room, they found Soren and the Raskari delegation already there. General Kroloth stood near the center, his golden armor dented but intact. His eyes blazed with fury as he turned to Lyra. "This is an act of war," he snarled. "Your coalition is behind this, isn't it?" Lyra bristled, stepping forward. "Don't be ridiculous. Why would we sabotage our own negotiations?" Because your people are cowards who fear Raskari dominance. Kroloth roared, his claws flexing. Enough! Thakirian's voice cut through the chaos, their glow flaring to a commanding white. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to them. This attack serves neither the Dominion nor the Coalition, they said, their translator conveying a steady, authoritative tone. It is the work of those who wish to see us divided. We must not let them succeed. Kroloth glared at Thakirian, but the fury in his eyes dimmed slightly. If you're so certain, prove it. Lyra took a deep breath. We will. But we need to work together to figure out who's behind this. The tension in the room was palpable, but Kroloth finally nodded. Fine. But if I find evidence that your coalition is involved... Lyra held his gaze. You won't. Later, in the privacy of the quarters, Lyra slumped onto the couch, exhaustion creeping in. Well, that could have gone worse. Thakirian stood by the viewport, their glow a subdued green. The attack was calculated to sow mistrust. Its perpetrators understand the fragility of this truce. Yeah, and now it's up to us to stop them, Lyra said, running a hand through her hair. No pressure. Thakirian turned to face her, their glow softening. Pressure creates resilience, does it not? Lyra snorted. Spoken like someone who's never had to deal with Raskari temper tantrums. For the first time, Thakirian's glow shifted to a bright gold, accompanied by a faint, melodic sound. Laughter, Lyra realized. She grinned despite herself. Great. Now even you're laughing at me. Not at you, Thakirian said, their light dimming slightly. With you. Lyra's smile lingered as she leaned back, her eyes drifting to the nebula outside. Despite the chaos, she felt a strange sense of hope. They were far from out of danger, but in Thakirian she'd found an ally she could trust. Chapter 4. The Enemy of My Enemy. The investigation into the explosion began immediately, but progress was slow. With tensions already high, every piece of evidence was scrutinized through the lens of suspicion. Lyra found herself in the thick of it, coordinating with station security and attempting to keep the Raskari delegation from walking out. It was during one of these tense briefings that Thakirian, who had remained mostly silent, abruptly spoke up. Their bioluminescent patterns flared with purpose as they leaned over the holographic display. This pattern is deliberate, they said, pointing to the fragmented readings from the explosion site. Not random, but calculated. Lyra frowned, leaning closer. What do you mean? Thakirian traced the data with one elongated finger, their glow shifting to a steady blue. The detonation was designed to create confusion, not destruction. Its placement ensured minimal casualties, but maximum disruption. Soren, who had been reviewing security reports, nodded in agreement. That would explain why the damage was mostly superficial. Whoever did this wanted to sabotage the negotiations, not destroy the station. Lyra rubbed her temples. Great. So we're dealing with someone who wants to keep us at each other's throats. Could it be one of the rogue Dominion factions we've been hearing whispers about? Kroloth, who had been pacing at the back of the room, snorted. If you're suggesting this was one of my people... I'm not suggesting anything, Lyra interrupted, fixing him with a sharp glare. But if you have splinter groups operating without your oversight, you might want to consider the possibility. Kroloth growled low in his throat, but didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Thakirian. You say this was deliberate. Can you prove it? Thakirian's glow shifted, their patterns growing more intricate. Proof will require access to the station's sensor logs and greater analysis. But the intent is evident in the precision of the explosion's placement. Lyra looked to Soren. Can we get those logs? The captain nodded. I'll request them from Station Command. Good, Lyra said, turning back to the group. In the meantime, we need to show a united front. Whoever's behind this wants us divided. Let's not give them what they want. Hours later, as Lyra and Thakirian pored over the newly acquired sensor data, a breakthrough emerged. Here, Thakirian said, their glow intensifying. They highlighted a faint, almost imperceptible signal in the logs. A stealth ship. It used the explosion as cover to escape the station undetected. Lyra's eyes widened. You're sure? Thakirian nodded. Its energy signature is faint, but unmistakable. Lyra straightened, her mind racing. If we can track that ship, we might be able to find out who's behind this. Thakirian hesitated, their glow dimming slightly. Pursuit will require leaving the station. It may provoke further distrust among the delegations. Lyra exhaled slowly, considering the risk. Yeah, but if we don't follow this lead, we're back to pointing fingers and guessing. Let's loop in Kroloth. If we can convince him to come along, it might help build trust. To Lyra's surprise, Kroloth agreed to join the pursuit, though not without conditions. You want my cooperation, he said, towering over her in the secure meeting room. Then I command my own forces. I won't have Raskari's strength diluted under coalition oversight. Lyra folded her arms. Fine, but this isn't a war mission. We're investigating, not attacking. Krolotha's eyes gleamed. If the trail leads to my enemies, they will not escape justice. Deal, Lyra said, extending a hand. Kroloth stared at it for a moment before clasping her forearm in a gesture that nearly crushed her bones. The pursuit led them into the outer edges of the Carina Nebula, where the stealth ship's faint trail finally gave out. They arrived at a derelict mining station, its skeletal structure barely clinging to the asteroid it was built upon. This is where the trail ends, Soren said as the ship docked. But there's no sign of life aboard. Then we'll go in and confirm, Lyra said, grabbing a tactical vest. Thakirian, you with me? Thakirian stepped forward, their bioluminescence glowing with determination. Always. Kroloth joined them, his towering presence both a comfort and a warning. Let us hope your instincts are correct, human. Inside the mining station, the air was stale, and the dim lighting flickered erratically. The team moved cautiously through the narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing in the hollow structure. This place is a tomb, Kroloth muttered, his claws flexing. If your lead is false. Wait, Thakirian interrupted, their antennae twitching. Their glow shifted to a sharp white as they gestured toward a control panel. Energy readings. This station is not as abandoned as it appears. Before Lyra could respond, a sudden hiss filled the air, followed by the clatter of movement. From the shadows, figures emerged, humanoid, but clad in mismatched armor and wielding improvised weapons. Pirates. Lyra guessed, raising her weapon. No, Kroloth growled. Mercenaries. The leader of the group stepped forward, their helmet obscuring their face. You shouldn't have come here, they said, their voice distorted. Too late for that, Lyra replied, her tone sharp. Who hired you? What's your connection to the explosion on the station? The mercenary tilted their head. The same people who want to see your little truce fall apart. And we're not about to let you ruin their plans. With a flick of their wrist, they signaled an attack. The battle was swift and chaotic. Lyra ducked behind cover as energy blasts ricocheted off the walls. Kroloth charged forward with a roar, his claws tearing through the mercenaries' ranks. Thakirian moved with uncanny grace, their bioluminescence pulsing in rhythmic patterns that seemed to confuse and disorient their attackers. When the dust settled, The remaining mercenaries fled deeper into the station. "We need to catch one alive," Lyra said, her voice tight. "They're our only lead." Thakirian nodded, their glow shifting to a determined green. "Then we must move quickly. The silence of this place grows restless." Lyra couldn't argue with that. Together they pressed deeper into the station, determined to uncover the truth behind the attack, and the forces conspiring to destroy their fragile peace. Chapter 5. Stars That Whisper. The dim corridors of the derelict mining station twisted like a labyrinth, the faint hum of aging machinery the only sound apart from their footsteps. Lyra's heart pounded as she clutched her weapon, the tension in the air sharp enough to cut. Beside her, Thakirian moved with uncanny silence, their bioluminescence casting faint patterns on the walls. Behind them, General Kroloth brought up the rear, his massive frame barely fitting in the cramped passageways. "We're close," Thakirian murmured, their translator barely audible. Their antennae twitched, picking up subtle vibrations in the air. The mercenaries are regrouping, but they are not fleeing. They are waiting. "For an ambush," Kroloth growled. He flexed his claws, his golden eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Good. Let them try." Lyra shot him a glare. "This isn't about picking a fight, Kroloth. We need one of them alive. If we don't find out who hired them, this whole mission is pointless." Kroloth's lips curled into a feral grin. "I'll leave one breathing." "Barely." Lyra shook her head but said nothing. She didn't have the energy to argue. The weight of their fragile truce already felt like a noose around her neck. They emerged into a wide chamber, the heart of the station. The room was dominated by a central control console, its surface covered in blinking lights and half-repaired panels. Around it stood a dozen mercenaries, their weapons raised and their mismatched armor gleaming under the flickering overhead lights. The leader of the group stepped forward, their face still obscured by a visor. "Persistent, aren't you?" their voice crackled. "But this is where your little investigation ends." Lyra stepped forward, her weapon aimed but her finger off the trigger. "We don't have to do this," she said, her voice firm. "Whoever hired you doesn't care about you. They're just using you to fan the flames of war. Help us stop them, and you might walk out of here alive." The mercenary leader let out a distorted laugh. "Walk out alive? You don't understand, human. If we talk, we're already dead." "Then we're at an impasse," Kroloth snarled, stepping beside Lyra. "And I have no patience for your cowardice." With a sharp gesture, the leader signaled their troops to open fire. The room erupted into chaos. Lyra dove behind a metal crate as energy bolts seared the air. Kroloth charged forward with a thunderous roar, his claws tearing through the mercenaries like a force of nature. The Thakirian moved like liquid shadow, their bioluminescence flickering in hypnotic patterns that disoriented the enemy. Lyra popped up from cover, firing precise shots that took out two mercenaries before ducking back down. "Thakirian," she shouted over the din, "we need that leader alive." Thakirian's glow flared bright white in acknowledgement. They vaulted over a piece of debris with inhuman agility, their movements a blur as they closed in on the leader. The mercenary raised their weapon, but Thakirian was faster. With a fluid motion, they disarmed the leader and pinned them against the console, their glowing patterns pulsating in an intense, unreadable rhythm. The remaining mercenaries faltered at the sight of their leader captured. Kroloth seized the opportunity, his claws flashing as he incapacitated the rest with brutal efficiency. When the dust settled, the room was eerily quiet except for the hum of the console. Lyra approached cautiously, her weapon still raised. The leader struggled against Thakirian's grip, their visor cracked and sparking. "Talk," Lyra demanded, her voice cold. "Who hired you? Who's behind the attack on the station? The leader let out a bitter laugh. You think I'll betray them? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Then enlighten me. The mercenary's visor flickered, revealing a glimpse of their face, a human, weathered and scarred. You're too late. The plan's already in motion. The nebula won't be yours, or theirs. It'll burn before anyone claims it. What plan? Lyra snapped. What are you talking about? Before the mercenary could answer, a sudden burst of light filled the room. Lyra shielded her eyes as a blinding flash grenade detonated, and when she looked again, the mercenary was slumped lifelessly against the console, their body limp and unmoving. No! Lyra shouted, rushing forward. She checked for a pulse, but it was too late. A tiny device embedded in the mercenary's neck was sparking, an implanted failsafe, designed to kill if they talked. Kroloth growled low in his throat. Cowards! They'd rather die than face justice. Lyra stood, her hands clenched into fists. Damn it! They were our only lead. Not entirely, Thakirian said, their glow shifting to a focused green. They gestured to the console. This system contains records. If we can access them, we may uncover their employer. Lyra's gaze followed Thakirian's gesture, her frustration giving way to determination. Then let's crack it open. It took nearly an hour, but with Thakirian's precision and Lyra's ingenuity, they managed to bypass the console security. The logs revealed encrypted messages, payment records, and coordinates leading to a hidden base deeper within the nebula. This is it, Lyra said, her voice tight. Whoever's behind this is there. Kroloth loomed over her, his claws tapping the console impatiently. Then what are we waiting for? Let's finish this. Thakirian's glow dimmed slightly. We must proceed with caution. If this base is their stronghold, it will be heavily defended. Lyra nodded. Agreed. We'll need to plan this carefully. But if we pull this off, we might finally have the proof we need to stop this war. As they left the station, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they'd anticipated. The nebula outside shimmered with quiet indifference, its beauty hiding the dangers that lay ahead. Stars that whisper, Thakirian murmured as they boarded their ship, their glow soft but resolute. They tell of light and shadow in equal measure. Let us hope we find more light. Lyra glanced at them, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Let's hope we make it out to see it. Chapter 6. Unity in the Silence. The coordinates led them to a remote sector of the Carina Nebula, where the dense clouds of gas and debris made navigation perilous. The base, hidden within a cluster of asteroid fields, was an unassuming station cobbled together from mismatched hull fragments. It pulsed faintly with energy, its external defenses blending seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. Lyra stood on the bridge of their small infiltration vessel, her fingers tight on the console. Thakirian sat beside her, their bioluminescence dimmed to a steady green as they monitored the nebula's interference with the ship's sensors. General Kroloth loomed nearby, his massive arms crossed as he stared out at the swirling gas clouds. That's the place, Lyra said, nodding toward the station on the display. Any closer, and we risk tripping their security grid. Kroloth grunted. Let them see us. I'm eager to tear through whoever's inside. We don't know what we're dealing with yet, Lyra replied sharply. If we charge in without a plan, we'll get ourselves killed. And then no one stops this war. Thakirian's glow brightened slightly. Stealth is our ally. We must remain unseen until we understand the station's purpose. Lyra gestured to the team of Coalition and Raskari operatives assembled behind them, an unlikely mix of species, united only by their leader's tenuous cooperation. You heard them. We're going in quiet. Our goal is intel first, engagement second. Kroloth let out a low growl but didn't argue. Then lead the way, human. The infiltration was harrowing. The nebula's electromagnetic interference made sensor readings unreliable, and the station's automated defenses forced them to take a winding route through the asteroid field. Once they docked at a blind spot in the station's hull, Lyra led the team into the dimly lit corridors. Inside, the station was eerily silent, its halls lined with flickering lights and exposed wiring. The air carried the acrid tang of recycled oxygen, mixed with the faint hum of machinery. Lyra's every step felt amplified, the sound reverberating through the empty space. "This place feels abandoned," one of the Raskari operatives muttered. "Looks can deceive," Thakirian replied, their voice soft. Their glow shifted to a cautious blue as they scanned the walls. "There is movement ahead. Faint, but deliberate." They pressed onward, navigating the labyrinthine corridors until they reached a control room. The space was dominated by a massive console and a bank of monitors displaying encrypted data streams. Thakirian moved to the console, their glowing patterns shifting in rapid pulses as they interfaced with the system. "This will take time," they said. "The encryption is advanced, but not impenetrable." "Make it quick," Kroloth said, his claws flexing. "I don't trust this silence." As Thakirian worked, Lyra studied the monitors. The data streams were fragmented, but certain pieces stood out: logs of intercepted communications, records of supply shipments, and, most chillingly, schematics for a massive weapon system. "What is this?" Lyra muttered, tapping one of the schematics. "A destabilizer array, designed to target ships' power cores. It would neutralize entire fleets," Thakirian confirmed, their glow shifting to an alarmed orange. "This is not a defensive installation. It is a staging ground for aggression." Kroloth snarled, slamming his clawed hand on the console. "So the cowards plan to strike both sides. Burn the nebula and leave no victors." "They're trying to make war inevitable," Lyra said, her voice grim. "If we don't stop this, the Coalition and Dominion will blame each other, and the galaxy tears itself apart." Thakirian turned to face her, their bioluminescence shifting to a determined white. "The weapon must be deactivated. Its destruction may draw attention, but we cannot allow it to remain operational." Lyra nodded, her jaw set. "Agreed. Let's—" The sound of approaching footsteps cut her off. A squad of mercenaries entered the room, their weapons raised. "Well," their leader said, a smirk audible in their voice, "looks like we have uninvited guests." The firefight was brutal. Lyra ducked behind a console as energy bolts flew past her, the sharp tang of ozone filling the air. Kroloth roared as he charged into the fray, his claws tearing through the mercenaries with savage efficiency. Thakirian moved like a phantom, their glowing patterns pulsing in disorienting rhythms as they incapacitated opponents with precision strikes. Lyra fired from cover, taking down a mercenary who had been aiming for Thakirian. "We need to secure this room," she shouted. Thakirian's glow flared as they slammed the last mercenary against the wall, rendering them unconscious. "Room secure." "Good," Lyra said, breathless. She turned back to the console. "Can you disable the weapon?" Thakirian nodded, their glow steady. "It will take time." "Then we hold the line," Kroloth said, his claws dripping with blood. "Let them come." As Thakirian worked, reinforcements began to pour in. The corridor outside became a battleground, with Lyra and Kroloth fighting side by side against wave after wave of mercenaries. Despite the odds, they held their ground, their unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of combat. Finally, Thakirian's glow shifted to a triumphant gold. "The weapon is neutralized." Its power core is destabilized. This station will no longer be a threat. Lyra let out a shaky laugh, wiping sweat from her brow. Then let's get out of here before it takes us with it. They escaped just as the station began to collapse, its structural integrity failing under the strain of the power core's destabilization. From the safety of their ship, Lyra watched the station disintegrate into the nebula's swirling depths. "We did it," she said softly, turning to Cragorian and Kroloth. "For now," Kroloth replied, his tone gruff. "The threat may be gone, but the mistrust remains. It will take more than this to unite our peoples." "It's a start," Cragorian said, their glow warm. Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the nebula. "A fragile start. But if we can stand together in this silence, maybe, just maybe, we'll find a way to keep it from being filled with war." Epilogue. Hearts beating as one. The Harmony's oath drifted silently at the edge of the Carina Nebula, its sleek hull reflecting the colors of the cosmic storm. Inside the ship, the tension that had hung over the mission like a dark cloud had finally begun to lift. The station's destruction had been a decisive blow against the forces trying to destabilize the galaxy. Now, the question was whether that spark of unity could survive the political storm to come. In the observation lounge, Lyra stood alone, her arms crossed as she gazed out at the nebula. She had replayed the events of the mission in her mind countless times since their return, weighing the victories against the sacrifices. They had struck a blow against the hidden threat, but the fragile peace between the Coalition and the Dominion was far from secure. The soft sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Cragorian entering the room, their bioluminescence a gentle gold, their patterns calm and serene. "You're up late," Lyra said with a faint smile. "Or is it early? I can't tell any more." "Time flows differently when one contemplates the stars," Cragorian replied, their translator soft. "I sensed your thoughts were heavy." Lyra chuckled lightly, leaning against the railing. "You sensed right. I'm just wondering if any of this will stick. If the Raskari and the Coalition can actually hold this together, or if it's all going to fall apart the second we leave this ship." Cragorian joined her at the railing, their glowing patterns shifting in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Unity is not forged in a single moment. It is a process, one that requires patience and understanding. "Easier said than done," Lyra muttered. "But you already know that, don't you?" Cragorian inclined their head. "The Valor have learned this lesson through pain and loss. Yet we continue to hope, to reach out. It is a fragile thing, but it is not without strength." Lyra sighed, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You make it sound almost poetic." "It is the truth," Cragorian replied. They turned to her, their bioluminescence brightening slightly. "And it is a truth that you embody, Lyra Quinn. Your resilience, your ability to see beyond conflict. These are the traits that make humanity remarkable." Lyra felt a warmth rise in her chest at the compliment. She glanced at Cragorian, her tone light. "You've come a long way yourself, you know. From the quiet, mysterious Valor envoy to, well, still quiet, but definitely not mysterious anymore." Cragorian's glow flickered in what Lyra now recognized as amusement. "Your species has taught me much, Lyra Quinn. In your imperfection, there is beauty. In your chaos, there is potential." They stood in silence for a moment, the nebula's light painting the room in hues of blue and gold. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice soft. "You know, I think this might be the first time in a long while that I've felt hope. Real hope." "Then perhaps it is the beginning," Cragorian said. "A first step toward something greater." Lyra nodded, her gaze returning to the stars. "I hope so. For both our peoples." When the ship docked at the neutral station to deliver their report, Lyra and Cragorian prepared to part ways. The Raskari delegation had already returned to their flagship, and Captain Soren was managing the final transfer of mission data. In the docking bay, Lyra turned to face Cragorian, their towering form radiating quiet strength. "Well," she said, her voice tinged with reluctance, "I guess this is it." "For now," Cragorian replied. They extended a hand, a gesture they had learned from her. But the stars often bring paths together once more. Lyra smiled, taking their hand in hers. "Let's hope they do. I'm not sure I can pull off another miracle without you." Cragorian's glow shifted to a warm gold. "You underestimate yourself, Lyra Quinn. Humanity's light shines brightly, even in the silence of the stars." They exchanged tokens of their journey. Lyra gave Cragorian a small pendant shaped like a star, a symbol of Earth's hope. Cragorian, in turn, gifted Lyra a fragment of their bioluminescent exoskeleton, its glow faint but steady. As the airlock hissed closed and Cragorian disappeared into the docking corridor, Lyra stood for a moment, holding the glowing fragment in her hand. It felt warm, alive, a reminder of the connection they had forged. She turned back to the viewport, watching as the nebula swirled in quiet majesty. For the first time, the silence felt less daunting. It wasn't empty. It was filled with potential, with the beating hearts of those willing to fight for peace. And in that silence, Lyra knew, humanity's voice would be heard.